Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Metabolic Classroom. I'm Professor Ben Bikman. I am a research scientist and professor of cell biology. This week is a bit different because I'm not discussing a particular topic, but rather sharing with you the good news that I'm happy to announce that my new book is coming out. The release date for the new book is July 11, and here it is. Now, you're going to notice some similarities in the title. My first book, which was Why We Get Sick, here over my shoulder, this is the follow-up, the companion book, How Not to Get Sick. Now, I want to just go through the book a little bit with you, but just as a background, when I first, in fact, this is a bit of an interesting insight into my own kind of professional journey here. When I first considered writing the book, Why We Get Sick, it was really because I thought I worried that there was a part of the medical conversation that was missing the main character, namely insulin resistance. And so by way of the kind of personal journey that I thought I might share with you, in the life of a professor, there's one achievement that stands out. You would think that when you're going through your PhD, when you're going through your postdoctoral fellowship, that the goal is simply to get hired as a tenured track professor. In reality, the goal is to get tenure, right? That getting hired as a professor is one thing, but you still are on this clock where about 6 years or so into your job, you're going to go through this process of a tenure review and to know whether you're going to stick around and basically have a job for life or whether you are out job hunting again. For me, once I got tenure at my university, I had an honest conversation in my office right here with myself. I was struck by what I worried was some of the irrelevance of academia, namely peer-reviewed publications. That as a scientist, the main metric of success, well, it's twofold. Am I getting grants to fund my research? But am I publishing peer-reviewed science manuscripts? Now, as a professor with undergraduate students, that's something that's important to me because I want to mentor these students and help them achieve their next professional goals. But if I'm being honest with myself, as all academics ought to be, as we all ought to be, I had to admit that these peer-reviewed papers really didn't do much to actually help someone's life. That the average individual would never read these peer-reviewed science manuscripts and would never have any benefit from them because of that. And so then I asked myself if my knowledge set about metabolic health and fat cell hypertrophy and insulin resistance as a key contributor to chronic disease, if it's valuable, am I not obligated to find a way to share it? And that was the beginning of not only my social media efforts, including Insulin IQ. You're watching this on the YouTube channel, whether it was Instagram or X or any social media platform, that was purely based and created from my desire to find a direct way of teaching metabolic ideas to people. At the same time, I realized that no one had written a book about insulin resistance directly. And that was Why We Get Sick. The original title I had proposed actually was The Plagues of Prosperity. I kind of love alliteration and liked the idea of the two P's coming together and these ideas of the diseases of civilization. But in Why We Get Sick, I framed it in a few parts. I wanted the reader to become familiar with what insulin resistance is, where it comes from, so the origins, why it matters, so highlighting the diseases that come from insulin resistance, and that's the bulk of the book. And then lastly, end with what to do about it. So again, sort of 4 parts, a book with 4 parts. What is insulin resistance? Where does it come from? Why it matters and what to do about it. Now, the what to do about it part, the original version of the book, it was extraordinarily modest. I had very simple ideas there. And then the publisher, Ben Bella, publisher, and my editor said, look, we got to put a little more meat here. Any of you who have connected with me for some time may have sort of learned my philosophy when it comes to implementing plans for addressing insulin resistance. And my general view is I'm a teacher. I'm a professor, and I love that job, by the way. I liked the idea, and still do, of being someone who can share ideas and share principles and then let you work it out. You decide how best to implement them. And that's what I did in Why We Get Sick. Now, however, some people want a little more than that. Some people want a little more direction, a little more specifics. That starts to put me, not only is it not particularly my strengths, but it also puts me in a bit of a weird position because I'm not a coach. I'm not a lifestyle coach. I'm not a nutrition coach. I'm not a personal trainer. And speaking of food and exercise, those are two things we're going to revisit in just a moment when we start talking about how not to get sick. But as much as I'm not a nutritionist and I'm not a personal trainer, I know a lot about those things. That's just not something I enjoy. That's not a role I want to play. I like being a professor rather than the coach per se. Does that make sense? It's kind of an odd dynamic here, and a frank admission of my own weaknesses. Nevertheless, after with the popularity of Why We Get Sick, there has been a lot of request for some specific ideas on how to take the raw science of where insulin resistance comes from and incorporate that into a more explicit plan of food and exercise guidance. That really was the basis for how not to get sick. Now, after everything I just admitted, you're thinking, well, Ben, you just said you're not a coach, you're not a nutritionist, you're not a personal trainer, and you don't want to be. That was why I brought on Diana. So I have a co-author on this book, which I am so grateful for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. But this is a book of two parts, where the first part of the book is the hard science of revisiting insulin resistance and then helping you understand where you are at. And first of all, how you determine your own insulin resistance status, and then following that up with the scientific evidence supporting some of the approaches that we get into in the book. So kind of pardon me as I'm looking at the camera and then looking at the book as I just share some of this with you. First and foremost, so ignore my little sticky notes here. Your copy that you buy won't have that until you put them in, but it's actually really lovely. I was quite thrilled. If you've seen any of my talks on YouTube, you can see some of the care that I put into my talks that I create. Very dynamic, very colorful, big colorful shapes that are always animating and moving. You can tell that I'm a college professor, that I'm used to teaching 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds, and I need to kind of keep them entertained. That's kind of how I look at it. My style of teaching is I'm telling a story, in that the picture that may be behind me on a screen is in fact just the picture that accompanies the story that I'm telling you. It's like I'm reading a picture book to you. That sort of starts to finally get incorporated into how not to get sick. Like you can see some of the figures. In fact, in some instances, they're figures that I've recreated from talks that I've given. In this particular case, it's me talking about physiological insulin resistance and some of the myths and misunderstandings that come along with it. So let me just sort of walk you through the book a little bit. And of course, my hope here is that this, of course, generates some interest in the book, but also just further cements my role as a teacher, someone who wants people to understand the root of metabolic health, namely insulin resistance and its origins, and most explicitly in this book, really what to do about it. So the first part of this book, it is a book of two parts, kind of my initial part of the science. And then the second part of the book, pardon me as I flip back to it, is the plan. So putting everything into action. And I hope you can appreciate all the color scheme. It really did just turn out lovely. And again, for a guy who likes things to look a particular way, I'm very pleased with how it turned out. So the first part of the book is the Am I Insulin Resistant? And for the first time I'm aware of, what I've done here is identify what I consider to be the best clinical tests, and in some instances, some at-home assessments that you can do as the reader in order to answer that question, am I insulin resistant? And so you'll notice these kind of cool little word boxes that I have just for little extra tidbits that didn't quite fit in with the body of the book. But so I have, first of all, these insulin-based tests. And then as you read through the book, you have these nice little charts where if you're able to get any of these tests done, you're able to put yourself into a particular range, and that range gives you a score of 1 to 3. So I have these insulin-based tests, including my favorite, the adipose IR score. You can read all about it. It's my favorite one that gives you insight into the state of your fat cells directly. In other words, how insulin resistant are your fat cells, which is where insulin resistance starts. But again, every score, every clinical marker you have, that number will give you a score of 1 to 3. There's the insulin-based tests. Then there are the lipid-based tests, because while some people can't get insulin measured too often, we always get our lipids measured. So I talk about the triglyceride glucose index. I talk about the triglyceride HDL ratio. And then ultimately, as you've been going through these tests, you've been giving yourself a score of 1, 2, or 3. And then I ask you to add them up. And that puts you into a category. In fact, I kind of have it demonstrated here, where you're going to be put into a place where when you start reading further into the action plan, you're going to be put into one of 3 categories. Are you currently insulin sensitive and you want to maintain it? That's not, most people are not. Remember, the statistics are quite sobering that most people are insulin resistant. But if you're among the lucky few, you may just be in a position where you want to maintain your insulin sensitivity, which is a great position to be in. You may be a person who's mildly insulin resistant and you want to just sort of reverse that quickly, or to get out of it, to prevent from going any further. That's the prevent phase. And then the reverse phase is all of your scores add up to suggest that you are very insulin resistant, and you got to turn that around as quickly as you can. Then I start getting into these 4 pillars, which you've heard me talk about before. And in an order that I consider to be, well, not a clear order, because I start with all 4 of these are actually super relevant. There's no order to them. The first one is touching on the relevance of fasting. And I really make the case. I look over a lot of the evidence. I talk about one of my heroes of physiology, namely George Cahill. You're going to love that part if you are interested ever in sort of any of the history of it. But you see some of these figures looking at insulin levels, and I explain why fasting is the fastest way to lower insulin. And we talk about some of the different strategies for fasting, but I always try making a point to remind you, the student/reader, how you end a fast matters more than how long you fast. And then I get in, speaking of how you end your fast, then I get into these managing macros, because managing macros matters most. So we talk about prioritizing protein. I have an emphasis, of course, on animal source proteins, but I highlight the relevance of plant proteins, especially the value of fermentation. A fermented plant protein is very, very different than a raw plant protein that has not undergone any fermentation. I talk about branched chain amino acids, a very popular supplement, and I kind of break that down a little bit because there's evidence linking branched chain amino acids to insulin resistance. Very, I would say, very problematic evidence that's been a little misunderstood. I emphasize the value of fat and show you, reproduce a figure from human studies, just reminding you that fat does not increase insulin, despite the debates. I talk about, of course, controlling carbohydrates, finally, as the last macro to manage. And just as a point of interest, I emphasize this figure when I talk about how dietary carbohydrates are not needed. That's not to be understood as me saying that blood glucose is not needed. Blood glucose is needed. And thankfully, through gluconeogenesis, the body is perfectly capable of making all of the glucose that we may need. And I just make a point of emphasizing that most of the glucose we have in our blood actually comes from lactate, one of the more misunderstood parts of human metabolism. By the way, humans do not make lactic acid. We make lactate. Okay, now you just heard me a moment ago talk about the value of fermented plant proteins. I am a fan of fermentation, and I talk about some of my personal fermented food favorites, especially when it does come to carbohydrates, which is the main macro that is fermented. Bacteria love eating carbohydrates. They don't touch fats, they don't touch proteins, they will eat those carbs, which is a sort of a particular benefit for us because there's less of the carb, which we don't care about. We want the fats and proteins. And in the process, the bacteria, after consuming the carbs, end up giving us some really healthy fats, namely short chain fats. So this is just an evidence of just some little personal touches you get here and there where I inserted some of my own personal thoughts as much as I'm really focusing on the science in my typical kind of light-hearted, cheeky way, I hope. I also insert these little moments of, my own opinions. Now, ultimately, as I mentioned a moment ago, after going through all of these principles that you will take advantage of to address your insulin resistance, it does put you into these three categories: reverse, prevent, or maintain. And I split that up a bit um, with regards to the macronutrients, because depending on where you are, it does suggest an inherent difference in your ability to handle perhaps carbohydrates. And so that influences a little bit of the strategy moving forward. And then lastly, speaking of moving, I talk a little bit about exercise. I break down the relevance of the liver in exercise and how that affects blood glucose, especially heavy emphasis on the role of skeletal muscle, which just by mass is most of what we are. Most of our body mass, when we're standing on the scale, if there's any particular tissue, it's muscle that matters most. And combined with the metabolic rate of muscle and its ability to really eat glucose as a fuel, it's no surprise that muscle mass matters enormously. And so I have very, very strong thoughts on the power of the value of exercise, and that comes into play in that chapter here, where I really review the evidence of exercise in particular. Then, as I mentioned, we get to the plan, and the plan, as I showed you earlier, breaks down into those three categories depending on where you are, whether it is reverse. And then if you are in the position of reverse, you are full insulin resistant. We sort of have this transition where, as you've been doing some of this, how do you know when it's time to kind of graduate to the next level? And it slides you into that prevent phase. And then eventually, hopefully, or maybe you're one of the lucky few where you're already there, you're in the maintain phase. And then Diana, wonderful gal that she is, extensive experience. She then really provides some direct exercise plans with just lovely pictures, and then incredible meals that you can see based on the color coding is broken down into the various macronutrients that the three macros that split into the ratios that we looked at with regards to reverse, prevent, and maintain. So the dietary portion gets split into those three categories. So it makes it really, really simple as you want to look at various meals that will help you in those three categories. You'll have them all laid out, not only in beautiful full color pictures, but also just absolutely delicious meals from top to bottom. Now, again, I'm not a meal prep guy. My capability in the kitchen is pretty limited. It's enough for my kids, for a breakfast, and that's about it. So that's where Diana's input was just so helpful. And I guarantee you're going to appreciate her very personal touch and her own journey of reversing insulin resistance and really taking control of her metabolic health. But that's where the two of these really come together. Again, her involvement in the actual meal and exercise planning allowed me to stay in the realm in which I'm very comfortable, namely that of professor. I want to teach you ideas so that you understand what's happening. I have to believe there is value in just understanding the process as much as most people just want pure plan. Just tell me what to do. That's valuable. Of course it is. But I just have to believe there's value in maybe added motivation for the plan itself, but there has to be some value in understanding why these things work. I really firmly believe that there is a value there, that it can help, if nothing else, then perhaps helping you have a little more motivation for incorporating and acting at changing your situation. So, how not to get sick. It's available anywhere books are sold. As ever, I'm so grateful for the support. I'm so grateful for you guys who have subscribed to the channel and have connected with me on social media. From the depths of my heart, I'm grateful. As a professor who believes he has a valuable idea to teach, there's nothing I want more truly than just having a bigger classroom, than having more people who can understand and apply these principles. The fact is, at the end of the day, the longer it takes us collectively to appreciate the metabolic origins of chronic disease, the longer the problems are going to just continue to grow, and the more expensive they're going to become, and the more burdensome they're going to become on personal life, and as we scale up, at a level of kind of country and economy. We cannot continue to try to reverse metabolic problems through pharmacological interventions. Metabolic disruption is a lifestyle problem. Thus, it requires a lifestyle solution. The food we eat and how we exercise is either the culprit or the cure. My hope is that with some education and some explicit planning, that you'll really experience some benefit from getting and reading and studying, marking, tabbing, dog-earing the pages, how not to get sick. Of course, if you haven't, read Why We Get Sick too. That just helps put it all in perspective. As ever, thank you so much for being part of this community and for connecting with me on Insulin IQ, and however else you've come to start listening to this freckled professor who just wants to teach you some ideas about metabolic health. Thanks, and I will see you next time.